Welcome back to the 6th video in this tutorial series on testing your React and Redux web applications using Jest and Enzyme. Now in the last video, we looked at testing our reducers, and in this video, we're going to be writing a different type of test. Now so far in this series, we've looked at writing unit tests. These are tests that test a unit of code without external dependencies. And in this video, we're going to write our first integration tests. This is where we test a unit of code with external dependencies. And the reason for that is because we're going to be testing our action creators. And in this particular application, we're going to be writing an action creator that includes an asynchronous request. So to do that, we're going to need to install two more dependencies. The first being Axios. This is a really great library that will allow us to really easily create asynchronous requests. And the second is Seos. This is going to be used specifically in our integration tests to mock a response from that API so that we can check our store and make sure that it is updated correctly. Now, before we dive into this tutorial, I just want to take the chance to encourage you guys to check out the official playlist for this series. All the videos that are being recorded for it will be posted here. There will be a direct link in the description of this video. Alternatively, you can look us up on YouTube by searching for SimpleTut and finding that playlist for yourself. Something else that's really important for you guys to know is that, of course, we are pushing all the code that we write in this series up to an official GitHub repository. Again, there'll be a direct link in the description of this video straight to this repository. So if at any point you want to check out or examine the code that we're writing rather than just following along with the videos themselves, then feel free to do that. Again, there'll be a direct link in the video. Alternatively, you can visit our GitHub account, which is github.com/SimpleTut, and look out for our testing repository. And finally, I'd also like to encourage you guys to like us on Facebook. Of course, this is a great way for you to stay in touch with us whenever we release new videos in this series or any other video that we might post. We will be posting links to that media and that content here. Okay, so before we actually get started, let's just come back over to this other tab where I've actually got this wireframe, this mock-up of the application that we're working on. And I also have the application itself running here in the background. And so far, we've really done a lot of the work that goes on behind the scenes. So we've done a lot of the layout components, and we're really ready to actually start working on more of the functional components. So if we come back over to this wireframe, you can see that the main components that we need to build out are going to be this button here. And remember, we're going to use this to actually dispatch an action that has an asynchronous request. And I actually also have Postman over here. And you can see that we are working with this placeholder API. And all that's going to do is just return an array of objects that has two main key value pairs, the first being a title and a body. And once we actually fetch that content, that data, we want to then render those posts out on the page like this. So that's basically how it's going to work. Now, before we can actually start working on the actual action creator, what I want to do is just do a little bit more of the groundwork. I want to build out some of the components that we're going to need. So the main one being like the button, which I think should be a component in itself. So let's go ahead and get started with that. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Now, as we already know, we have this components folder, and we want to use this to create some new shared components. So the first thing that we're going to do is create a new folder, and I'm going to create my button component. Okay, so let's create a button folder, and inside of this, we're going to do the same as we have done before. We're going to create an index.js. We're going to create a spec file, and let's create a styles.scss file. Okay, so the way that this button is going to work, it's going to be a shared component. So it's going to be a component that can be used throughout the application. It's going to allow the developer to pass two props to it, the first being a button text, and the second being some kind of an emit event. Now, the idea of passing a method to a component is that when this button is clicked, it's going to emit an event to the parent component, and we can then capture that event in the parent component and use that to dispatch some kind of an action with Redux. In this case, it's going to trigger it's going to allow us to dispatch an action that is going to go out and fetch some data from an API. So that's how it's going to work. Now, I am going to use the Tdd approach here. I'm going to write my tests first, but we do need some kind of a boilerplate in place for us to be able to actually write our tests. So let's go ahead and do that. The first thing I'm going to do is in my index.js, I'm going to import React, and I'm going to destructure a component from React. And then I am also going to import prop types. So I'm going to import prop types from prop types. And then we need to create our class. So I'm going to create a class. I'm going to call this my shared button, and it's going to extend component. And then we need our render method, and that needs to, of course, return something. In this case, we're going to be returning a HTML button. And then all we need to do is export default our shared button class. And I'm also going to just create our shared button dot prop types. It's going to equal an object, but I'm not going to define anything here just yet. So let's save that. We've now got our boilerplate in place. So let's come back over to our spec.js file. This is where we have our tests. We need to import a few things here. So the first being React itself. So I'm going to import React from React. I'm going to import those utility functions that we have in this file here. So we have the find by test attribute, we have check props. We need to import both. So I'm going to import from that file. So I'm going to import, I got to come out of this directory into the utils, and there's index. So we need to import the find by test attribute and the check props functions. And we also need to import the component itself. So we called this component, well, this class shared button. So we need to import that from index. And we're pretty much good to go. I may need to import something, but we'll see. I'm going to create my overall describe function. I'm just going to give this the name of the component, which is shared button component. Pass it a function. And then we can do a few different tests. The first being we want to check our prop types. So checking prop types and pass it a function. And the first thing we need to do here is we need to write our first test. So it should not throw a warning. If you remember from previous videos, we want it to return undefined. So again, we need to create a const here, expected props, and what we are looking for is button text. It's going to be a string. So example button text, and we need an emit event, and that is going to be a function. Okay, so we need to create another const here, which is props errors or error, and we're going to use this check props function that we've already created in a previous tutorial where I covered how to test prop types. If you've just joined us and you're not sure how I am doing this, then I'm actually writing code that I've already covered in previous videos. So if this is unfamiliar to you, then please reference a previous video in this series. You can find it on the playlist where I covered how to test prop types. In this video, we're looking at testing action creators, and I'm not going to go over the same stuff that I've already covered. But if this is unfamiliar to you, then please reference some of the earlier videos in this series. As you know, this is the 6th video, so we've already covered quite a bit. Now again, to this function, we need to pass our actual class and that expected props. And then we need to make some kind of an assertion. So I'm going to expect that prop errors. And again, if you remember, we want to expect this to be undefined. So to be undefined. Okay, so that's our first test. Let's come over to terminal, and it's actually pausing because we actually we haven't expected anything. If I expect something here, it would actually have an impact. So the first thing we want to actually do is we want to check for those. So the first being button text. So let's check here that this should be, we're going to use prop types. This should be a string, and then we have this emit event, and this should be a function. So func. Okay, so now it's actually still pausing because I'm passing the correct value of my expected props. But let's say that this emit event is not a function that I'm passing a string. Let's come back over, and you'll see that the tests are failing. So that's perfect. We know it's working. That's awesome. So we've written our tests to check our prop types. We now want to just make sure that we are rendering a button. So to do that, I'm going to write another describe. And we're going to say that it renders. And what we want to do here is we just want to do a check. So we're going to do a before each first of all. So before each, we need to pass this a function, and before each, we need to declare a wrapper, and then we want to pass wrapper. So we actually need to import. I forgot to import from Enzyme. We need to import shallow, and we need to do a shallow render here of our component. And we are going to need to create some props. And what I'm going to do is I am going to, again, I'm going to pass it the same button text here, and then we'll pass that to our shallow render. Okay, so that's our before each, and then let's come down and let's write our first test. So it should render a button. Again, we want to pass a function here, and we're going to create a const button equals the find by test attribute. We need to pass it our shallow render, which is our wrapper here, and then we're going to be looking for our button component. And if I come over, we actually want to make an assertion here as well. So it's going to be that button.length to be 1. And again, if we now come over to our terminal, it's just failing. We're expecting 1, we're getting 0. Now if I add this test attribute, so data test button component, let's come back over. Our test is now passing. Now I want to do another check here, and I'm going to say that first of all, just above my return, I'm going to destructure from props. So this dot props, and I want to destructure this button text, and then we're going to take that and we're going to render that in our button itself. Okay, so I've already kind of explained how this works, or is going to work. When this is clicked, it needs to emit an event. So we're going to create a method on this class. We're going to call this, I don't know, let's say submit event here. we're going to do a check here. So if this.props.emit event, if that exists when this method is called, we're going to fire it. So this.props.emit event will fire it. And we need an onClick here. So we'll say onClick. We'll say this dot submit event. Okay, so we're going to trigger it. Okay, awesome. So let's go ahead now and check our terminal, and all of our tests are still passing. That's great. So that's pretty much it for our button component. We've written our tests, we've written out the file. I haven't used the styles file. I may come back to this. I'm not sure if we really need to style it. This is more of a functional tutorial, but we probably will. We'll come back to this. I don't want to waste too much time here. And let's actually have a look at our sort of wireframe here. And really, when we actually get our data, we want to loop through these results. But really, the logic for this section, each one of these individual, let's say, list items, really this should also be another component in itself. So I'm going to create a component for this as well. So let's go ahead and do that. So in the component file, let's create another folder. I'm going to call this my list item. And inside of this, we're going to create the same three files. So index.js, we're going to create spec.js, and we're going to create styles.scss. All right, so let's go ahead and write out the very similar code here. So we're going to import React, and we want to destructure component from React. We want to import prop types, so import prop types from prop types, and then let's go ahead and use that. So we're going to create another class. We're going to call this list item, and that's going to extend component, and in here we're going to have our render method, and we want to return a div for now. And here we'll just export default list item. And again, we want to create our prop types, so we're going to have list item dot prop types equals an object, and all we want here really is a title. That's going to be a string, so we want to have here prop types dot string, and also we have our description, so we're also going to have prop types here dot string. So that's our prop types defined. Okay, cool. So let's leave that here. This is our sort of boilerplate here, our skeleton of our component class. I'm going to come back over to our spec file for this file, and I'm going to import React from React. We want to destructure from Enzyme shallow. And again, we want to import those utility functions, so we're going to import from the utils file, and we want to import the both find by test attribute and the check props functions we previously worked on. And I'm also going to import the component itself. So again, we called this our list item, so we're going to import list item from index. Awesome. So this is going to be a pretty similar class to test. So we're just going to say that this is our list item component. We'll need to pass it a function here. And this first describe we're going to write here is going to, again, it's going to be for our prop type. So again, describe checking prop types. We'll pass another function here. And again, the first thing we'll do is we'll create a test. Should not throw a warning. And then the first thing we'll do is we'll create a const here for expected props. And that's going to be an object, of course. Now, if I remember correctly, the first is a title. We'll say that this is an example title. And the second is going to be the description. And we'll just have some text here. That works fine. We then need to create a const for props errors or error. And we're going to use this check props function we defined. Again, we need to pass it our component and then our expected props. And then we just need to make an assertion. So we're going to say expect that we're going to expect that props errors to be undefined. Sweet. So let's go ahead and let's have a look at our terminal here. And again, all our tests are passing, but let's actually change something. So instead of title being a string, let's make it a number. Let's come over to terminal, and yep, our test is failing. So that's correct. We verified that that test is working correctly. Again, our tests, they're now passing. So let's write another describe. Let's say component renders. Pass it a function here. And what we want to do is just check that we are rendering the component, that we're rendering a title, and we're rendering a description. So we need a let variable called wrapper. We're going to have our before each here. And in before each, we're just going to do a shallow render. So I'm going to get this wrapper equals shallow, and we're just going to do a shallow render of our component. But again, we need to create our props, so const props, and this is going to just be the same as this, so we're just going to use that same schema. And then we're going to use the props for our shallow render. And then we can just write some tests. So first being is should render without error, and we'll pass a function here. And again, we'll just do wrapper. Actually, we'll do const component equals find by test attribute, and the first thing we'll pass is our wrapper here. And we want to check for our list item component. And then we need to make an assertion. So we'll assert that component length to be 1. And then we want to do 2 more tests. So the first being that it should render a title. So very similar, we're going to do const title equals find by test attribute, and we'll pass it the wrapper. Oops. And we'll just say component title. We'll make an assertion, so expect that title to be 1. Oh, sorry, title.length. And finally, we want to check that we should render a description. So we'll do const description equals find by test attribute, we'll posit the wrapper, and then component description, and we'll do an assertion. So we'll expect that the description.length to be 1. Sweet. So those should all be failing. So let's check our terminal. And sure enough, we have 3 tests failing. And that's because we haven't actually created any of those test attributes. So all we need to do inside of our render method is we want to destructure this props. We want to destructure title and description. And then what we'll do is we want to have a data test attribute here. And let's just check our tests. So let's list item component. This is on the main wrapper. And then we're going to have like maybe a h2 where we render our title. And this is going to have a test, our data test. It's going to have our data test here. And it's component title, I believe. And then we'll just have like a, I don't know, maybe a div here. A div will be fine. Data test, and we'll say component description. That's what we're checking for. So, and then we'll render that. Okay, so let's check that. So, yep, component title. Let's check our terminal, and again, all our tests are passing. That's fantastic. So let's go ahead and save it. Now, I think what would also be a good idea here is that if if the title doesn't exist, we should return null. So I'm actually going to come back over to the spec file here, and I'm actually going to add another describe function here. And this is when it should not render. Pass a function here. And what we want to do here is check that it doesn't render. So we're going to copy this code we wrote here for our before each, but I'm going to remove the title. Okay, so we don't want to render this if we don't have a title. Shouldn't render. So what we'll do is we are going to say that it component is not rendered. And we'll do a const here, component equals find by test attribute. We're going to posit a wrapper, and then we need to posit the same list item component, and we need to make an assertion. So we're going to say expect component dot length to be 0. Let's come back over to our test. Our tests are still passing, so that's working perfectly. Cool. So I think that's a very well tested component as well. We've pretty much covered everything we need to. We've got everything in the component ready to be used in the application. Okay, so at this point we're finally ready to create our first action creator. So inside of my actions folder, I'm going to create a new file called index.js, and we need to import two things into this, right? So we need to import our types object, so we can import that from types. And again, this is our types file here where we've defined our types. So I'm just going to import types. That's our constant. And then we need to import a library that we're going to use to make asynchronous requests. Okay, so that's going to be called Axios. So to do that, I'm going to come back over to my terminal. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to end my current processes. I'm going to kill everything in my terminal. And I'm going to go npm install Axios. And I'm going to click return. And it's going to go ahead and install that library for me. So this might take a while. I'm just going to come back when it's done. And as you can see, that has been installed. So I'm just going to rerun everything. So npm start and npm test. And as you can see, that is now rerunning my application, and my tests are running again in the background. So let's come back over to VS Code, and we can import that. So we want to import Axios from Axios. Okay, so let's go ahead and write our action creator. So the first thing I'm going to do is export const fetch posts, and that's going to equal a function, and then we're going to create an async function which is going to accept dispatch. And what we're going to do is we're going to make an asynchronous request using our Axios library. So we're going to need to await a response. We're going to use the get method. And actually what we need to do is come over to Postman, and as you can see we have this placeholder API that we're using. Now again, I'm going to post this link in the description of this video. Alternatively, you can probably fairly easily just copy it from the screen if you are following with this video. And in our then method, what we're going to do is we're going to get the response, and we're going to dispatch. So we're going to be using type, our types constant. So we're going to say types.getPosts, and if you remember in our types, we've already defined that here. And then of course our payload, and it's just going to be res.data. And then of course, it's always best practice, we want to catch any errors, so we're going to catch those errors. And then for now we'll just do a console log of the error, but I'm probably going to comment that out for now. And that is pretty much our action creator. That's all we need to do. And again, the tests that we're going to write here, because we are using Axios, we're going to actually use another library called Moxios to write an integration test, and we're going to do that shortly, but we're not actually going to do that right now, because what I want to do is I want to, we've kind of written all the different parts, moving parts of this application. What we really need to do is link them up, and then once they are sort of in place and actually working, we're going to write an integration test that will actually help us test this action creator. So we want to check effectively that the store is being updated correctly. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's actually integrate all of these different components and our action creator. Let's integrate them into our application. So we want to go into our app.js, and the first thing we need to do is import the various things that we are going to require to do this. So the first being those two components. So we have the shared button. So we'll import that from that component, which is in component, and then button. We have our list item. So list item from, again, it's in the component folder, list item. And we're also going to need something from React Redux. We're going to need connect. And of course, we're also going to need our action creator. So to do that, to import that, we'll go import from actions, and then it's an index. So we want to import that fetch posts action that we previously created. So the first thing that we'll do is we need to connect our component to the store. So to do that, what we'll do is we'll create another const here, map state to props. It's going to equal, so state will return posts, state.posts, and then we're ready to use connect. So here we're going to use connect, and what we want to pass here is our map state to props, and then the action that we imported, which is fetch posts. So that's now connected, and what we need to do is, first of all, let's actually input our shared button. So what we want to do is, first of all, let's create a let's create a method on our class, our app class called fetch. And if you remember the way I told you that the button is going to work, the button is going to be, it's going to receive a method from the parent class, and when that button's clicked, it's going to submit that event to the parent. The parent can then dispatch the action that goes out and fetches data. So what we need to do is create a constructor here, and it'll be clear why I'm doing this in just a second. But what we need to do also is within our return, our render method above our return, we're going to create a const which is config our button. It's going to be an object. The first one being the button text, and I'm just going to say that I'm going to say get posts, and then we need to have our emit event, and that is going to equal this dot fetch. Now, because of the fact that we are passing this this method to the component, we need to bind it in our constructor. So we're going to say this fetch equals this fetch dot bind this, and within this method itself, when this is called, we want to dispatch our action. So we're going to say this dot props dot fetch posts, and then what we can do is just take this config object, and wherever we want to render our shared button, so we'll say shared button, but we're going to use this spread object to pass that to our button. So if we actually come over to our let's come over to our browser here. So let's come over to our browser, and as you can see, we have our button. It isn't styled, but we didn't style it. That's easy to do, but it is in there, and if we just check our console, it shouldn't actually render any posts. We haven't configured it to do that, but we're not seeing any errors, which is fantastic. So let's come back over to actually it actually should be fetching the posts now, so we can check that. Let's actually refresh this for now, and let's come over to React, and let's come down to our app, and you can see there's posts, so we have connected to the store. This is our action here. If I click this, I then get 10 objects. So these are the results coming from the API. So that's awesome. So we know that this is working, so all we now have to do is render them out on the page. So to do that, it's actually pretty simple because we've done a lot of the work already. So all we need to do is we need to have a little conditional statement. So first things first, just under our render method, I'm going to destructure from this dot props. I'm going to take posts, and what we want to do is if posts dot length is greater than 0, we are going to return this div, and inside of this div we're going to map through posts. So we're going to say posts, we're going to say posts, just one posts dot map, and this is where we are going to use our list item component. So post and then index, and we want to return our list item component, and as you know, our list item component is already set up for us to pass some props. So I'm going to destructure from post, and I want to destructure it is title and body. The API returns title and body, but we want to create another const which is to config list item. It's going to equal an object, and title is fine, but we want to pass description with the value given to us in the body. And then we can take that configuration object, use a spread, and then we can take this object and use a spread object and pass that to our component. Okay, so let's also remember to add a key, which we have to do in React when we are mapping through something. And that's looking good. So let's come back over now to the browser, and let's click on Get Posts. And as you can see, we're rendering them out on the page, and that's working fantastically. Let's also come back over to our terminal, and as you can see, all the tests are passing. Let's rerun our tests, and as you can see, all of our tests are passing successfully. So in actual fact, if we compare this now to our wireframe, it's pretty much there. We've pretty much finished building out most of the application. What's remaining is to actually create our integration test to actually make sure that we can mock a response from the API, and that our action creator is dispatching the action and our store is getting updated correctly. So let's go ahead and figure out how to test that. Okay, so before we can actually go ahead and write the code for our integration test, it's really important that you guys understand exactly what we're going to be checking for. So what we want to do is we want to create a test store, and then we want to check that that store is updated correctly once we run our integration test. Now the key point there is where I said test store. So if I actually come back over to our create store.js, this is what we created when we implemented Redux earlier on in this series. You will notice that I created and I exported this middleware's array separate to the other create store functions. The reason I did this was because I want to use the same exact middleware that I'm using in my real world application as I am for my tests. It's just better that way. So I'm actually going to utilize this in my create store function for my tests. And I'm going to create that as a utility function. So I'm going to come over to my utility file here, and I'm going to import the various different things that I need. So the first one being, I'm going to import from Redux. I want to import apply middleware and create store. The next thing that I need to do is import my root reducer. So root reducer from source reducers, then it's index, and then finally I want to import my middlewares. I'll import that from source and the create store file. So I'm going to import that middlewares array. Sweet. So let's go ahead and create our test store. So I'm going to export const, and I'm going to call it my test store. It's going to equal a function that accepts some initial state. And what we're going to be doing here, I'm going to create a const called create store with middleware. And what this is going to do is it's going to take the apply middlewares. We're going to pass our middlewares, and we're going to create store, and then we just want to return create store with middleware. We're going to use our root reducer and pass our initial state. And that's it. So we now have this utility function that we can use to create our test store, which we're going to use in our integration test. Now, whenever you write any kind of application, the first thing that you generally consider is the architecture of that application. That's the layout, the file structure, that's how you want to write your code. And going forward, it's really important that you get that right, because you want to make sure that it's always going to be easy to maintain and other developers can come along and work on your application, and it can be as smooth a ride as possible. So up until this point, if we look at any of our other tests, for example, in our components, we have a spec file inside of each of our component folders that relates to that particular component. And that makes sense. The problem with what we're going to do now is that we're going to write an integration test. This test is going to involve reducers, it's going to involve our action creators. So it wouldn't really make sense for us to add a single test file into any component folder because it doesn't really relate to any single individual file that we're testing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder inside of my source folder, and I'm just going to call this my integration tests. All right. And the beauty of this is that I'm just going to create one file called index.js, and I'm going to put all of my integration tests into this file. But again, as I've said before in other parts of this tutorial, you guys can write your application your way and whatever makes sense to you. Something else that is really important is that we're going to need to install another dependency. Now, as we've already seen in our action, we used another library called Axios to actually make our API requests, to make our HTTP request, which is what we use to actually go out and fetch our data. Now, to test this, we're going to use another dependency called Seos. And you can probably guess from the name, it's going to allow us to mock a response from this API. Okay, so it's a really great library. If you haven't heard of it, then it's definitely something that you should know about going forward. So let's go ahead and add that to our project. I'm going to kill everything running in my terminal, and I'm just going to run the install command. So yarn add. I'm going to add this as a dev dependency, so I'm going to use that D flag, and I'm going to install Seos. Okay, so let's click on return. It's going to add that dependency to my project, and this may take a while, so I'm going to come back when it's done. Cool, so that's now finished installing for me. So I'm going to restart my application with yarn start, and I'm going to rerun my tests. So yarn or npm, let's do npm test. Okay, so that's running my application, and it's running my test script. And again, all my tests are still passing, which is great. Okay, so let's go ahead and write our integration test. Now, I've just noticed that when I actually created this file, I called it index.js. That's not going to work. We're going to rename this file to spec.js. That is a recognized test file name. So I've just adjusted that. Let's come back over and check our tests. And at the moment, this test file is actually failing. And the reason is that as I've mentioned before in previous tutorials, that our test files need at least one test actually to pass. So the first thing we need to do is just go ahead and import the various dependencies that we need. So the first one is going to be Seos. So actually we're just going to import Seos here. We need a few other things. So for example, we need our utility function for creating our store. So let's come back to our utility file. Let's import that. It's an index, and it is called test store. And we also need to import our action creator itself, so we can import that from our actions file. So actions, it's an index, so we can just go ahead and import fetch posts. Awesome. So let's create our describe function. It works the same way. So we want to give it a string. So let's say that we are testing our fetch posts action, and let's pass it a function here. And then the first thing that we want to do is we want to run a before each. We need to pass a function here. What we want to do is we want to install Seos. Now the reason that we do this is because what this is going to do is whenever we hit Axios, it's going to update the library so that it doesn't actually go out onto the internet and make a request. All right, it's just going to replace it with Seos. Now, if you have some kind of an API instance, then you would pass it here. But at this point in this application, we just have a normal Axios request. So for us, all we need to do is just Seos install. Now, in the same way, you might have guessed, we need to do an after each. So after each, and we need to pass a function, and we need to do Seos.uninstall, and that's just going to restore the Axios library to its former state. Fantastic. Right, so now we're ready to write our first test. So let's go ahead and do that. And what we want to test for is that our that the store is updated correctly. All right, so let's pass a function here. And the first thing that we want to do is we want to create a constant of our expected state. All right, so this is what we expect the store to be updated with. Now, I just created this as an object. It's actually going to need to be an array of objects. And this doesn't need to actually match the schema that is returned from the API. I'm only actually going to add a title, which is a string. I'm just going to say example title 1, and then actually the body, which is just going to be some text. And I'm going to duplicate this a couple times. So let's go ahead and do that. I'll update this from 1 to 2 and then 3. Okay, so you also notice up here we imported our test store. So I want to create that as well. So I'm going to create const store equals test store. I'm going to call that method, that function. And we're now ready to handle the request itself. So to do that, all I need to do, it's pretty simple. It's just Moxios.wait. And this accepts a callback function. And inside of this, we're going to create a const called request. And that's going to equal Moxios.requests.mostRecent. And then all we need to do is request equals request.response with, and we're going to give it a status of 200. That's a success status. And then the response, is going to be the expected state. And then all we need to do is just return our store.dispatch. We want to dispatch our fetch posts action creator, and then we can just do a then, and we can just pass a function here and create a constant of new state, and that's going to equal store.getState, and then we can just make some kind of an assertion where we say expect new state, and we only want to test part of the state, which is going to be posts. And we want to just basically expect that to be our expected state. So let's save that. That's awesome. Let's come back over to our terminal, and you can see that our test is passing. Okay, that's awesome. But we probably want to see our test fail. So to do that, instead of giving a response of our expected state, let's just pass an array, an empty array. Let's come back over to our test, and our test is failing. You can see that this is what it expected, and it just received an empty array. So let's restore this back to expected state, and let's come back over to our tests. They're rerunning, and they are passing. So we know for a fact that that is working. Okay, so let's just clean this up. There's a few extra spaces here. Let's just clean that up. That's looking good. And at this point, just going to congratulate you guys because you have written your first integration test. Let's come back over to our application and let's actually rerun it. So let's actually, first of all, let's check our terminal. There's no errors. Let's click on get posts. Okay, cool, that's working. Let's use the React DevTools. And let's check what we have in our store. So there's our posts, and as you can see, we are receiving everything correctly. And again, as I said, there's no errors. That's awesome. So at this point, I think we're in a good place. So let's commit our changes. So come back over to our terminal. Over here in this window, let's do a git status. There's quite a lot of changes that we've made here. And I'm just going to go git add all, do a git status, see if there's anything I want to remove here. There is. I'm going to exclude this yarn lock file. Lock files shouldn't be committed. Otherwise, everything looks good. So I'm going to go ahead and commit that. And I'm just going to call this my tests for actions git status. Cool. Let's do a git push origin. And I'm going to push up to this. I've been working on a feature branch called testing actions. So I'm going to push that to my remote repository. And following this tutorial, I'm going to create a pull request and merge that into the master. And that brings us to the end of this tutorial. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'd just like to encourage you guys once again to visit the official playlist for this series as we go through and add more videos. And record more videos. We will add them to this playlist. You can either find a link in the description of this video, or you can search for us on YouTube, which is SimpleTut. Again, I would really appreciate if you could like, comment, and subscribe to us. Again, your support goes a long way to making sure we can continue to serve you guys the same content that you're currently enjoying. Another thing is, of course, this is the official repository on GitHub for this project, and as you just saw, we're constantly pushing all the code that we're writing in this series to this repository. So if at any point you want to examine the code that we're writing in your own time, then feel free to check this out. And I think, again, this is a great reference point for you guys to come back to. And again, please star this project. Again, your support, as I said, goes a long way. And finally, please like us on Facebook. There'll be a link to all of these things in the description of this video. But again, you can find us at facebook.com/SimpleTut. And if you do like us and follow us on Facebook, then of course, when we release new content for this series and future videos, then we will post them to our Facebook channel. So it's a great way for you to get notifications when that content is released and becomes available. However, at this point, I just want to thank you guys for following this video and supporting this series. It really does mean a lot. I'm looking forward to the next video where we're going to be looking at testing connected components and specifically looking at the dive method. But for now, thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you again in the next one.